Welcome everyone to what I think is going to be a really important, really timely discussion. My name is Carlos Martinez. I am co-editor of Friends of Socialist China and the author of The East is Still Red, Chinese Socialism in the 21st Century. I will be chairing today. 5 years ago, when we launched Friends of Socialist China, talking positively about China felt like an uphill battle, even in relatively progressive circles, even in socialist Marxist circles. China was routinely dismissed as, a rival imperialist power to the US, a surveillance state, a human rights abuser. China was supposedly setting debt traps and carrying out land grabs in Africa and Latin America. The slanders about Xinjiang, about Hong Kong, about Taiwan, about Tibet were everywhere, and they had some traction even on the left. And if you fast forward to today, there's been a tangible shift. You have this China-maxing phenomenon that we're talking about today, where you have young people in the West discovering and celebrating China's achievements in culture. And even if it's a meme, and even if it's transient, and even if it's got some kind of Orientalist or problematic elements to it, the fact is that it would have been more or less unimaginable a few years ago. There are many reasons for this shift, and our speakers are going to cover some of those reasons in detail. But in these introductory remarks, I'd just like to pick out one factor, which is the Gaza genocide and the extraordinary resilience and heroism of the Palestinian people, and how they've changed the world forever. And part of the way they've changed the world is how people see China. And three things in particular stand out, right? Um, First, people now know what a genocide looks like. They've watched it in real time on their mobile phones for 2.5 years. And when they're told that it's not Israel that's committing genocide, but China, with no bodies, no satellite evidence, no refugee crisis, no bombs, they no longer accept it. A few years ago, the notion of a Uyghur genocide was apparently plausible to many people. Today, it is not. Secondly, Gaza has shattered trust in Western ruling classes and their media. Governments that cheered on the slaughter of tens of thousands of children, that vetoed ceasefire after ceasefire, that kept the weapons flowing to Israel, these are the same governments, the same media outlets that have been spreading anti-China sentiment for years and telling us that the CPC, the Communist Party of China, is the cause of all their problems. And people are drawing some obvious conclusions. Thirdly, people are comparing the basic orientation of Western governments with that of China. The governments of North America and Western Europe are arming and financing a genocide. They're providing diplomatic cover for war crimes. They're shielding Israel from accountability at every international forum. China, on the other hand, has called for a ceasefire from day one, has demanded Israeli withdrawal from day one, has brought 14 Palestinian resistance factions to Beijing to build reconciliation between them, has consistently stood up for international law, has consistently stood for peaceful dialogue, has consistently stood for Palestinian national rights. So as we celebrate China's achievements today, we also acknowledge the incredible bravery, the incredible humanity of the Palestinian people in the face of genocide, colonial occupation, apartheid, and ethnic cleansing. Um, Now, our first speaker was going to be George Galloway. I don't think he's with us yet. Let me just check. No, he's not. Um, the second speaker was Danny Haiphong, who I don't think is with us yet. Okay, so our first speaker, in fact, is going to be Li Jingjing. Hopefully she's ready to speak. Jingjing is a journalist and broadcaster with CGTN, which is China's English language television network, where she reports on Chinese and international politics. Known for her accessible and direct communication style, she's played an important role in helping international viewers understand Chinese perspectives on major global events, from the COVID-19 pandemic to the ongoing US wars of aggression. Hey, Jingjing, over to you.
Hi, thank you, Carlos, and thank you, everybody. I'm so honored. First, before my speech, I really want to say I'm so honored to be here and be among all the guests gonna give a speech today because all of your work inspired me to continue to speak up and share true stories from China. So, I think today I want to share um, the stories of how China's system changed ordinary Chinese people like me and so many others in smaller cities and villages, how the system changed our lives over the past few years. For example, I am someone who was born and raised in China. And I was born in the 80s in a working class family. My family wasn't exactly impoverished, but definitely not wealthy. So my parents told me when I was a small kid, they didn't know, nor did they have enough resources to feed me enough protein. So they regretted to this day that they didn't provide me enough protein, enough food. So I'm a short person to this day. That's their regret. A private bathroom with the flushing toilet definitely was a luxury for many families in China back then. So my parents were catching every opportunities possible they could to provide me with a better life. And then something changed. I think many people of my generation probably have the same experience. In late 80s and 90s, when Western mainstream pop culture got into China, we were all so stunned and amazed. We were looking up to the advanced technology and lifestyle in the West. So it feels like every concept and culture from the West seems to be the ultimate goal. It's like we were having a really wide time of our life back then. So many of us, our generations in the 80s and 90s, we did go to the West. I went to study in the UK, and it was one of the best time of my life. I remember I kept praising to my family and my friends about everything I saw in UK, everything I tried, everyone I encountered, and keep complaining to them why we didn't have that back in China. I traveled to many other European countries and the United States and did the same thing. But that reality quickly reversed. China's development speed is so fast and feels like every 5 years is a new era. For example, many of you have been to China. The convenient Alipay, WeChat, shared bikes, super fast deliveries, the spectacular drone shows, humanoid robots, grand museums. Those cool stuff came to existence and became popular only in the past 10 or 15 years. And now when I travel to Western countries, I complain a lot. I complain in the United States, I complain in other European countries why there's no basic stuff like affordable and fast public transport. And it's also funny that I started to really look into the pros and cons of China's system and the Western systems after I traveled to other countries, Western countries, and came back to China. The more I see in the West, the more I understand what socialism with Chinese characteristics truly means, and I truly appreciate it. Besides my own experience seeing different countries and the stories I just told you, another contributing factor that changed me is working as a journalist in China. I traveled to different parts of China and talking to people from all villages, from different ethnic groups, and saw different realities. So I think at today's webinar, as a journalist, I think I will continue to take you to see my first person perspective. And how about we start with the two sessions, which took place in March in China. Top two sessions is China's annual most important political meeting that the whole country set the yearly goal, yearly plan for the whole country. And this year is particularly important because this year we start our 15th five-year plan, a crucial start for us to achieve our second centenary goal. I will share some videos that I took to help you to see how the deputies to China's National People's Congress do their work. So at China's two sessions, actually each province, each delegation is open to media. So media from around the world, actually you can just go to the delegation to see how they are carrying out their meetings. Can you see the screens now? Yes,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah, yeah.
So first I want to share with you examples of two delegations. One is Guangdong province, and the next one will be Yunnan province. The first video is the Guangdong province. As you can see, this is the open grading hall, and they are showcasing their best technologies like the virtual reality goggles. And hundreds of deputies from whole Guangdong province, including their provincial leaders, party secretaries, are there, along with journalists. And now you are seeing the journalists from around the world, international journalists, a lot of Southeast Asian journalists. They are so packed. So when some Western media they make videos complaining why China's deputy to National People's Congress are avoiding Western journalists, that's not true. They have open day. It's open to every journalist. I film all this with my phone. No one is hiding away from my camera. And the deputies is now giving a speech to their provincial party secretary. So the reason I'm sharing Guangdong is because Guangdong is the national leader in technological innovation and the new quality productive force. So Guangdong's GDP has been number one for 37 consecutive years in China. So Guangdong province is main contributor for China's economic growth every year. In 2025, Guangdong province alone, the GDP reached 1.4 trillion yuan. So it's a core driving force for China's economic growth, but shoulders the national mission in areas such as technological self-reliance and self-strengthening. So all the cool, for the example, the humanoid robots, all the spectacular drones, all this cutting-edge technology actually was invented. The hub was in Guangdong province. And I'm sharing this example of Guangdong is because Guangdong is a perfect example of China's development. A whole province is leading the economy of the country and make breakthroughs in technology, innovation. But why I'm going to share the next province is Yunnan. Can you see the video is changed to the slide, change to another slide? Okay, so, and Yunnan is the opposite. So that's the beauty of when you see in China, there are so many provinces, there are so many differences. Yunnan is such a beautiful country, nature blessed, with all of the amazing food, but it was battling with poverty, deep poverty. So it was really among the last battlefield for poverty alleviation. By 2020, I think over 8,300 villages were lifted out of the extreme poverty. And why this province could be lifted out of poverty? So I interviewed three grassroots deputies. They were farmers. They were doing the frontline works, helping the villages. They are also deputies to the China's National People's Congress, bringing voices straight from the grassroots farmers village in Yunnan to the national level, to Beijing, talking directly to people's central leaders. And here's a 3 minutes video I'm going to share with you. International viewers often ask me, how did China lift people out of absolute poverty? I think because China has people like them. This is Nong Jiagui, a teacher at a primary school in a remote village in Yunnan. He single-handedly helped 126 kids to get an education. In 1986, the then 20-year-old Nong went to a village where many patients with leprosy lived, and their kids didn't have access to education in those isolated mountains. So he decided to stay, became the only teacher there, and changed those kids' fate.
最缺少的就是以外界沟通为界个外面的什么事情。
In 40 years' time, he helped 126 students graduate, and later they became doctors, teachers, and policemen.
那些学生就经常说，假如罗老师当初遇到困难的时候，只要你再犹豫一下，不再接触，我们这一辈子就永远走不出这个大山。
With his consistent efforts, the school has turned from this to this. As the deputy to China's National People's Congress, he continued to push for more policies to improve village kids' lives. This is Li Zhizhen, manager of a pig farm.
While many young people would go to bigger cities after graduation for opportunities, she decided to go back and contribute to her village. With the knowledge she learned, she helped the villagers to run industrialized operations and earn much more income. When talking about the changes she brought to her hometown, she said,
我们唯一一条高速公路就是你们提的建议怎么落实的？对，都是这条路经过我们提建议以后立即到地方为我们进行调研，然后用最快的时间，可能大了2个星期就帮我们通了。
As the deputy, she needs to frequently visit every household in the village, do research, and understand the struggles and challenges villagers are having, so she can bring these issues to the government and push for policies. She is the bridge connecting grassroots people and the government. If you wonder whether their voices are truly being heard by the government, here's the data. In 2025, the Yunnan delegation made 20 proposals collectively, 10 of which have been listed as key proposals by the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress to supervise and handle. All deputies' proposals were processed and received replies. Lifting a large population out of extreme poverty seems like a mission impossible, but because of the dedication and perseverance of people like them, the material reality of Chinese people keep improving. A country's success is not determined by how many billionaires or oligarchs it has. It's determined by whether the least privileged people can live a life with dignity.
So this is what's it like talking to the deputies who are making changes in China. They are all farmers. And when you talk to these deputies, they made so much changes. Like the second girl, she's in her 20s. She's so proudly say the only highway in my village is because of my proposal. I brought this opinion to the country. Another deputy I interviewed is the party secretary. The woman barely speaks standard Mandarin. She said, I govern 11 different small villages. So these 11 villages are scattered on 11 different hills. So she used to walk to different hills to make sure she can talk to all those villagers. But now, because of her proposals, all these 11 villages are connected by roads, even by trains. She's so proud. So I also want viewers to understand when Western journalists came to China, came to sessions, and when they say they cannot talk to, no Chinese deputies are talking to them, I don't know whether they really truly want to talk to the Chinese deputies. If they truly want, you have to remember those people are farmers. They don't speak any English word at all. But if you can talk to them sincerely, either in Chinese or through a translator, you will understand how much work, effort they put into changing their lives. And they are able to talk to central leaders to make the changes. So I think so far you probably saw the dramatic difference between different provinces. Guangdong is the #1 GDP for 37 years, but Yunnan province, so ethnically diverse, where many 8,000 villages were just lifted out of extreme poverty by 2020. So what's the problem? I think we saw the imbalanced development. So this report of China's 19th National Congress of the Communist Party of China pointed out that socialism with Chinese characteristics has entered a new era, and the principal contradiction facing Chinese society has evolved into the contradiction between unbalanced and inadequate development and the people's ever-growing needs for a better life. So we have many tasks and pressures internally and externally right now as we are achieving our second centenary goal. But addressing the imbalance in urban and rural development remains a long-term and historical task for China, and addressing the issue of regional development imbalance is a long-term strategy goal for the country's development. So next, as we entered the 15th years plan, the provinces, regions like Guangdong, who got wealthy first, they will play their constructive role, leading China's technological innovation and use their resources to help the less developed regions to develop, to make sure no regions, no villages are left behind. And Yunnan is now said goodbye to extreme poverty because of those grassroots deputies. And now they are moving to the next goal is continue to revitalize the rural regions and make sure they catch up. And in the end, last, I want to say China's system may not be the perfect system that suits everyone or every country, but it constantly reforms itself. It's willing to try new methods that no one has ever done before and learns from mistakes, adapts to the new realities and new challenges to make sure it's always a functioning system dedicated to uplifting the average, the ordinary Chinese person. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jingjing, for that extremely moving and inspiring presentation. And it's so important to remember that China's achievements aren't only about kind of relatively abstract notions of GDP growth or technological innovation or things that can easily be measured with, in numerical terms. They're also about these stories of transforming the lives of ordinary people. And I'm sure I speak for all of us when I say that I'm glad to note that your early protein deficiency didn't blunt your analytical skills or your communication skills. So thank you very much again. So the next speaker is going to be Tings Chak. Tings is an artist, researcher, and writer who works as Asia coordinator of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. Based in Beijing, she is the lead author of Serve the People, The Eradication of Extreme Poverty in China, a landmark publication that brought China's poverty alleviation achievements to international audiences in an accessible and compelling form. Tings, let me ask you to unmute. Okay, please go ahead.
Thanks, Carlos, and thanks for the invitation. And it's really great to share this event and space with comrades and friends that I admire very much. I think some of the things actually complements what my good friend Li Jingjing has just shared. I think from a slightly different perspective, I'm someone who is from Hong Kong, but got, my schooling in the West in Canada, and also spent a lot of time living and working in Global South, many movements and left organizations. So, but one thing definitely, I think, I definitely as a young immigrant in Canada, I never imagined that China could be cool someday. And I certainly never imagined that socialist China could be cool someday. So here we are, and we see these things of, the modern cities going viral and the dancing robots doing martial arts or BYD cars in basically any streets of cities across the global south, high-speed trains. People are drinking hot water now. So I wanted to, start asking is how did that happen, and to what do we actually credit for it? And I think this sometimes gets lost a little bit in the media, even in the sympathetic and the growing sympathetic voices, especially younger generations. Of course, the title of this event, like the Socialist Chinamaxxing, already hints at that. Of course, I have to say that Chinamaxxing is a trend that's overwhelmingly based in the US and the global north. I don't think it's something that really has reached many global south countries, but I think this says something about the state of the West, of global north countries, particularly in the United States, where, when they see the skylines of Chongqing and all that cyberpunk stuff, it's also a reflection of seeing their own cities that aren't functioning, infrastructure that isn't working, a state that is absent in their lives, where poverty is actually increasing, the inequality is rising. And so what is it about China that's not just cool, that allows it to actually overcome some of these things, no less from a developing global south country that was extremely poor not that long ago. And I think from the other side, when I look, having spent, primarily living several years in South Africa and Brazil, I think sometimes the views also have China's advances mean something different. I think for countries that have gone through basically 4 decades of, the Washington Consensus and structural adjustments, they've watched their limited industrial capacity dismantled, in exchange for these conditional loans, et cetera. The same old story of there is no alternative. Seeing China, I think, also represents something important, which is that another development model that is not based on the Western capitalist model, whether you think it's socialist or not. And of course, I think in this event, we're here to defend that China is socialism with its own characteristics. But I think for many global South countries, especially from a left perspective, it's actually China's existence represents that maybe there's a possibility of a global South country escaping the sort of dependency trap, and that maybe there's a chance of building an industrial capacity, pursuing the unfinished national liberation process, and on their own terms. And I think in this way, it's really to understand that the socialism is something that, though it's not very much seen in the viralizing images and videos, is what's at the heart of this. And I'm going to give some examples based on my experiences, especially in the last years living here, based between Shanghai and Beijing, and having a lot of opportunities that I'm very privileged to have to go visit rural areas and other places across country. So I guess Jingjing has already talked about poverty alleviation, and I think that's an important one. And Carlos already gave a very, very generous bio of me. But having been able to spend that time, I think studying and talking with party cadre and talking to women, talking to peasants and youth to understand what is it that helped eradicate extreme poverty in China. Jingjing has stated a lot of the things around the personal life transformation. There's really, when we talk about 100 million people that were lifted out of extreme poverty in less than 10 years, that's 100 million stories, plus everyone else that was involved in that process. And there's probably never time enough to tell those stories. But I think one of the things is there's sometimes a myth that's saying, okay, these 100 million or 800 million over the course of 4 decades is because China went capitalist, right? Opening up reform, introduced certain market elements back into the system. There are capitalists in China, there are billionaires in China. So really, this is a kind of capitalism done right. And so in the study and actually going to talk to people, you realize it's not. It's a very specific aspect of Chinese socialism. For one thing, it's sending the 3 million cadres to live and work and be with these families, coming and developing plans so that each family comes out of and lifts themselves also out of extreme poverty. And I think that these are aspects that often don't get seen with a sort of, wow, isn't it great that China is doing these things? And of course, I'm, just a few minutes, I'm not going to go through all those things. And hopefully some of you will have a chance to read the study if you haven't already. And I think sometimes we also see the things like, oh, these, high-speed rail or the, 5G technology, the advanced technology. It's, China is no longer producing the kind of knockoff tennis shoes and now actually competing in the advanced sectors of technology. That's amazing. But one of the things I think when you go to the rural areas and you realize what this actually means in the lives of the people, and that you realize that this is something that capitalism would never do. I recently went to Rongjiang, which is a county, and Jingjing's also done coverage of that, in Guizhou province, which was one of the last counties to exit extreme poverty. And together with Professor Lu Xingyu, who we collaborate with very closely at the Tricontinental. And there it's been focused on this grassroots football league based in the villages and the peasants that organize these football tournaments. And it's interesting to see that, in the last few years, this has become a national phenomenon. And how does that become, how does it that peasant farmers in a rural area, in a county that maybe no Chinese person really knew about, 5 years ago, becomes a phenomenon? And this, you start having to understand, this has to do with the construction of 5G that reaches now basically 100% of villages in the country. This has to do with the building of not only high-speed rail, but you're talking about highways that are piercing through the most mountainous region of the country that has really no profit margin or profit motive to be able to do if this wasn't the state coming in to build this infrastructure and connecting regions that have not been connected to the rest of China for literally 5,000 years. This has to do with not only the cadres being sent there on many different levels of organizing agricultural production to, engaging like people who are there just being the sports narrators, at the games, or the people helping with figuring out how to use these technological tools they call now the cell phone as a new agricultural, production factor, because this is something that's being integrated. Now it's not only just about producing the goods, it's also around being able to, market them through these platforms to be able to reach middle-class urban buyers and consumers. It's also about bringing that technology and that infrastructure, allowing young people who are now educated in the cities, have gone to universities, having a chance to return back to the countryside and contribute to their home counties. And I think this is also one of the aspects I had a chance also to visit when there were also some comrades visiting from the Global South, particularly from Brazil, linked to the Lands Workers Movement, which is called the MST, one of the largest peasant and social movements in the world, not just in Latin America. And I think for them, when they were able to visit and they saw also Brazil, of course, a major football culture, and they saw how that was demobilized to deal with questions of poverty in a collective way, to deal with questions of agricultural production, but also to elevate and create conditions where there is also joy and pride and cultural confidence that's generated for a region, not only just for Rongjiang, but for a lot of, I think, rural areas, has been always maybe carried the weight or a chip on the shoulder of being, so-called more backwards, underdeveloped, that where modernity is or modernization was actually in the cities, and you have to migrate to the cities to be able to enter, the modern world. This is a real reversal and saying, no, the future is also in the countryside. It's also rooted in traditions, completely linked with all the technological innovations that exist in today. And I think the final thing I want to talk about is oftentimes I'm thinking back to, that famous now viralized video of, I think it was around 2011 when Elon Musk was asked about BYD electric vehicles, right? And that, he burst out laughing, said, well, have you seen their cars? Saying that no one would ever buy their product and the technology is not very strong. And today, of course, BYD has already overtaken Tesla as the world's largest electric seller of electric vehicles. And even Musk himself has had to concede that, okay, Chinese EV makers have pretty much demolished other car companies in the world. It's not just about surpassing the US, and this is not the point, I think, of this discussion, but I think it said something. Well, how do we understand the EV vehicle development, and why is it distinct from other experiences? And this is where we've had a chance through Tricontinental to work with. We actually published one of his articles, a Marxist scholar and economist named Meng Jie, who has been really trying to study certain sectors such as EV vehicles, such as high-speed railways, to understand what he's been calling the constructive markets, how the actual state under the leadership of the CPC is able to not only construct the market side, but also the whole productive chain. This is very much part of the country's state planning, and how it actually manifests itself is not let the market deal as the market will and to resolve the problems. And I think even when we see some things like EVs, however cool and however fancy they are, I think the part around the socialist construction part always gets missed. And this is the thing I wanted to bring into this discussion. Of course, everything we're seeing today, I mean, China has a very unique system and went through a process of a revolution and is still in the process of, primary stage of socialist construction. This is not a model that can be copied, not for Western global North countries, nor easily for global South countries. But I think it's very important to also take advantage of this moment when there is a final interest in saying, yes, China has made significant advances, and many of it's actually cool. And in a moment when we are seeing a decline of US hegemony, US imperialism, that's basically laid its face bare for all of us to see, from the genocide in Gaza to the bombing of Iran, to the kidnapping of sovereign state leaders like Maduro, is that China is actually developing a different model. And I would defend a socialist one that we should study and be open to. So thank you very much. And I'm really happy to be part of this discussion today.
That's great. Thank you so much, Tings. Really, really excellent presentation, and fascinating to hear about the transformative power of network connectivity as part of China's poverty alleviation strategy. And that put me in mind of a couple of things. Firstly, that here in Britain and in many other countries in the West, Huawei is banned from our 5G network infrastructure, essentially in service of a McCarthyite Red Scare anti-China narrative, right? So people here are having to pay more for a worse service just to support a campaign to suppress China's rise. A campaign that won't even work, by the way. And the second thing that came to mind was that, well, isn't it great that China enjoys its digital sovereignty and that its digital ecosystem is regulated in such a way that it serves the people and serves the country's national development goals, rather than being dominated by a handful of private companies and psychopathic or sociopathic or misanthropic billionaires whose only goal is to extract profit regardless of its impact on society. So again, thank you very much. The next speaker, George Galloway, needs very little introduction. He's a veteran British socialist politician and broadcaster, quite possibly the most prominent anti-imperialist voice in British public life. A 7-time Member of Parliament and now leader of the Workers' Party of Britain. He's known internationally for his fierce opposition to the Iraq War and his consistent solidarity with Palestine, and of course, Iran and Lebanon, which countries have been facing a criminal onslaught since 28th of February. He is also a long-standing friend of Socialist China. So, George, I will ask you to unmute. And another person has come on as Galloway. Let me check if this is George. George?
Carlos?
You've joined. Okay, wonderful.
This should be better. Are you here?
Wow, I'm the invisible man.
Are you there, George?
I am in audio. I hope now in vision. If you can see and hear me, Carlos, kindly nod.
Yeah, quite clear.
My greetings to you from Moscow, in the middle of the Orthodox Easter and on World Cosmonaut Day, which makes it auspicious doubly in Moscow, and may or may not be contributing to the extreme connectivity issues that I'm currently facing. My sincere apologies for missing the start of the meeting, and to those fellow speakers whose contributions I have missed, but I already caught enough to know that you are all very considerable China experts, and I am sadly not. But I do know something about socialism, and I do understand the need in this webinar to insist that China is a socialist country. It's not a socialist country in the way that this country, Russia, was once. It has its own special characteristics, and I've spent enough time in China in the last 6, 7, 8 months to know that if it was not for socialism, then China would not be the success story that you've all been discussing in the webinar so far. And I can pray in the time available to me several things in aid of that. But if I begin with the extraordinary effort being made by the CPC, by the government in Beijing, to bring about more equality between regions, I have some first-hand experience of that. My wife and I recently made a documentary film for CGTN in Xinjiang. When I say recently, we made it about 7 months ago, so of course it's not out yet. Things take quite a while to get to air on China, but I hope you'll like it when it does. But one of the things which immediately became obvious was that the efforts at regional policy, it's not quite accurate to call it regional policy because Xinjiang is an autonomous part of China, not like the northeast of England. But if you compare the efforts being made by the central government in Beijing in Xinjiang with the total lack of efforts being made by the central government in London to relieve the depressed areas, as we must now call them, Britain's coastal plain, for example, coastal areas, the former industrial areas, or the Rust Belt areas in the United States, which are essentially left to rot. Far from leaving Xinjiang to rot, the Chinese government is striving might and main to raise living standards, to invest in infrastructure on a quite astonishing scale, on a cosmonaut scale. So, for example, in the very well-appointed main hospital in Kashgar, I began to be acutely aware that the top specialists that they had there in every department were not from Xinjiang. They were definitely not from Kashgar. They were from all parts of China, from the highest universities in China, from the most advanced hospitals in China, and they were working at what can only be described as the frontier. It is literally the frontier with Pakistan just across the border and other developing countries just across the border. But the first world standards enjoyed in that hospital were the result of basically a national mobilization of resources and of staff to lift this hospital into first world status. Now, as is already implied in what I said about the depressed areas of Britain or the rust belts of the United States, only socialism does that. Capitalism would allow areas on the periphery or areas that had passed their optimal economic importance, would leave them to rot, and the people in those areas would be moving to the cities. The people in these areas would be moving to places that were more happening, but the opposite is happening in Xinjiang. So when I asked the head of the hospital, who'd taught at Sanford, he taught at Strasbourg, he had been educated further in England, he could have been a top medical guy in any part of the world, but he was in Kashgar. And when I asked him why, I could no longer avoid saying, well, a guy like you, why are you living here? And he was plain that the government requires us to be here. The state requires us to be here. The party, in his case, as a party member, requires us to be here because it's our duty to make sure that the gap between rich and poor people in all of China and the gap between rich and poor areas in all of China is closed rather than expanded, as indeed it is in capitalist countries. And I watched an operation take place remotely from 4,000 kilometers away. I saw someone being operated on machinery which was state of the art by a surgeon 4,000 kilometers away. That's socialism. Such treatment for the masses, for the workers, is a dream in capitalist countries now. Because of my age, I lived briefly in a moment when in Britain we thought that kind of thing might become possible for all of the working class, but it was only a moment. It didn't last very long, and it's long forgotten by most people. So if you like, the efforts being made at closing the wealth gap between rich and poor and between rich areas and poor areas, I pray in aid of the case that China is socialist. The motor cars that the former speaker was referring to on the EV phenomenon is another example. I may tell you that in Moscow there are no cars except Chinese cars. If you look at the number of the top of the range Chinese cars here, they are in such numbers that you actually see more of them here in Moscow than you do in China. But the success of these industries moving from what she said, an economy of knockoff tennis shoes. Not that there's anything wrong with the knockoff tennis shoe business, by the way. I'm a great believer in it, having spent quite a bit of time in Shanghai recently. I hope I'm not giving away any trade secrets. You get the best knockoff gear to be found anywhere in the world, and I see it as an anti-capitalist move to buy as much of it as I possibly can. But China has moved so far beyond that. And the EV industry, the telephone industry, the phenomenal success of Huawei and Xiaomi, these are all evidences of the strength of and the benefits of a state-led economy. It's a mixed economy, to be sure, but the state plays the leading role. As the CPC plays the leading role in the state, so the state plays the leading role in the economy. And it shows. Again, I demonstrate my point in reverse. Look at the state of British capitalism, where the state has no role at all and no interest at all, and no resources in any case at all, having wasted such resources as we have on war and weapons and making enemies of the rising parts of the world. It's obvious when you take the briefest look at China's industrial development, its infrastructural development, which beggars all description, bridges to what in Britain would be called a bridge to nowhere. Well, it's not a bridge to nowhere. It's a bridge to, albeit a small community, but still a community of Chinese citizens who need to be connected to the other side of the gorge. These things could never happen in a capitalist economy. A simple calculation would be made, and they'd say, well, the 4 or 40,000 people living on the other side of the gorge will just have to uproot and move because the cost of linking them by infrastructure is just too great. These are all obvious signs of socialism in China. My last point, I realize I'm overstaying my welcome. My last point is this: if China wasn't socialist, it would be involved in war everywhere. If China wasn't socialist, it would be invading other countries. If China wasn't socialist, it would be playing the same kind of role in the world that the United States is playing. After all, it's equal to the United States in every regard, and maybe superior to the United States. I happen to be one of those who believe that China's economy is already the biggest economy in the world. But even if it isn't, it's definitely on a par. And what we know about capitalist development, the capitalist model, is that capitalism on that scale inevitably leads to imperialist
Did we lose George? George, if you're still there, then we're all waiting with bated breath to hear your closing remarks. But failing that,
I've just unmuted myself. Can you hear me now, Carlos?
yeah, you're back.
It didn't. It's on. It's on.
We can hear you.
Hello?
Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you, George.
Oh, okay. So I was just making the point that if China were not a different kind of country to the United States, it would be behaving like the United States, as Britain behaved when it was an economic hegemon, the equivalent in its day of the superpowers of today. But China does not behave like that. China seeks peace everywhere. It seeks diplomatic and political solutions to conflict everywhere. And this alone, although there are 100 other reasons that one could cite, and no doubt will be cited in the course of this webinar today, is proof positive to me that China is a superior form of social organization. It's a superior form of humanity's drive on World Cosmonaut Day to the stars. And if it's superior, in what way could it be superior to globalized capitalism? In what way could it be superior to the finance capitalism that we in Britain basically are now entirely dependent on? How is it superior? Well, we think that the fact that it's led by the Communist Party of China since its inception, that its great achievements across the decades, and the role that it's playing and seeking to play, and we hope that it will play increasingly in the world, is reaching for the stars. And the stars in this case mean a world where war is banished, where hegemony is a thing we read about as having existed in the past, where domination and bullying are banished forever, to sit with the historical dunce's cap that they deserve. China's form of organization is demonstrably superior. And if it's superior, I call it socialism. I know that that will not be everyone's definition of socialism, but I'm one of those that believes that capitalism was the highest form of human development when it burst upon the scene, but that containing, as it does, the seeds of its own disintegration and decay, it has been succeeded by a superior form of organization. And that superior form is the People's Republic of China. To quote the Webbs, over the last 6, 7, 8 months in particular, I have seen the future, and it definitely works. Thanks very much, everyone, and my apologies again for my connectivity issues.
Thank you so much, George, for a very powerful speech and for making the effort to join us in, albeit in difficult circumstances. And, you know, people can see one of the things that makes George such a special politician is that he says things that are true. regardless of whether they're popular, regardless of whether they fall within the limits of mainstream acceptability. To call China socialist, and furthermore to do so in a positive way rather than, as a compliment rather than being some kind of McCarthyite slur, is something that I think almost any other British or North American politician, including on the left, would run a mile from, because in our Eurocentric, racist political culture, the idea that China could build socialism and that the Western left could actually take some inspiration from China's achievements, could actually learn something from China, is simply anathema. So thanks so much again, George. Our next speaker is Danny Haiphong. Danny is an American journalist, broadcaster, and political analyst whose work focuses on geopolitics, imperialism, Black liberation, and the socialist countries. His YouTube channel has become a must-watch for analysis of global events. He is also one of the founders of Friends of Socialist China, and he joins us today from China, having, I believe, just touched down a couple of hours ago. Please go ahead, Danny.
Danny hasn't unmuted himself.
Oh, I thought you unmuted me. I thought you unmuted me, Carlos. Sorry. No, but I was just asking to the great General Secretary, Carlos, please let me know if I'm lagging or if there's audio issues at all, because I might also have connectivity issues just getting here. So I'm joining from Beijing. Yeah, and we're doing it at a historic moment. The Chinamaxxing that we're talking about today is coming in the context of what I've been saying for many years now, but there has been more debate about this, whether US imperialism is actually in decay, and covering what has happened with the US-Israeli war on Iran, I think has exposed for the entire world to see, even for the political establishment in the collective West to see right in their faces, so much so that they cannot even lie about it anymore, that the U.S. empire, U.S. imperialism is indeed in decay. And China, I mean, it makes so much sense that now we are having in this moment where it's so much more apparent that this is happening, that there's this global shift, this global collapse of U.S. hegemony, that China would come in and inspire millions, billions of people around the world of what an alternative to this, decrepit and decaying world order can actually be. So I just wanted to go over exactly why, because I think it's so important to talk about this huge historical moment in the context of Chinamaxxing, this moment of Iran defeating the U.S. empire, and how China, you may have heard, has been coming up over and over and over again from before the first strikes, before the United States bombed the Manab school, killing over 160 young school children, young girls. Before this, we heard China's assistance to Iran is getting it ready to be able to defend itself from U.S. and Israeli aggression. And what have we seen? Well, we know that Iran's indigenous capabilities are incredible, but we also know that, and I say this all of the time, that if it wasn't for China's absolutely imperative economic, diplomatic, and political assistance to Iran, circumventing sanctions would have been that much more difficult. And so for this reason, China's major contribution in always rejecting sanctions, always rejecting the imperatives and the diktats of U.S. empire, that this allows a country like Iran to thrive. And then this allows Iran to do what it has done, striking back at the U.S. empire, making it so now the United States is on the back foot, having to essentially thrash and lash about to try to take back what it has lost, so-called freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz, the ability to say that its military capabilities are invincible to a country like Iran, which many believe didn't even have an air force, so that would make it completely vulnerable to U.S. air power. Well, it's been quite the contrary. We have seen the U.S. lose 30 plus aircraft And we have seen now reports that China, according to U.S. intelligence, will supply Iran with more air defenses. Now, we don't even know if this is true or not, but the fact that the United States empire always has China on the brain is not just because of Cold War and racist thinking. That's a big reason why, but it's also because China's ascendance is very real, and China's capacity to show what it can do around the world is very real and in a very different way. Because even if it were true that China was going to provide man pads to Iran, that's China's right within not only the laws of wars, but international law in general. Iran is at war, and Iran has every right to ask whoever it wants for trade and any kind of assistance militarily and economically to defend itself. And China has always stood up for the self-determination of oppressed nations, including Iran. So it's no surprise that the world is waking up, but the West is also waking up, the collective West. And this also has to do with the the outcomes of such a disastrous conflict like we're seeing against Iran. But Iran is really just an extension of what we've been seeing for decades now. The US empire extending itself more, financializing itself more, making itself more a pariah to the rest of the world, to the point where people are wondering what, not only what is going on in the United States, in Europe, but they're also asking, well, why would we why would we hate China? Why would it be China that's the enemy and not our own government? Trump did this, of course. We saw it was the tariffs, the TikTok ban that led to all kinds of curiosity. China stood up to the Trump administration, rejected the tariffs. A lot of people, I know ordinary people just in New York City, who are talking about that because the tariffs were hitting working class people's pocketbooks very, very hard. And then with Xiaohongshu and the ability for especially younger people, millennials, Gen Z, etc., to see the real China via social media, that has led to an explosion of China-maxxing, or people really just wanting to go to China, see China, experience China, understand China more, so that they can get a taste of what a future could look like that is directed by a completely different set of interests. So rather than endless war, rather than worsening poverty, worsening inflation, more debt, more police repression, more mass incarceration, more stripping of civil liberties, more environmental degradation, et cetera, China has shown now the world, and now it is becoming more and more clear to even people in the West that, yeah, China's development is an economic miracle. People just like even just seeing the cool lights. They just want to be somewhere where there's infrastructure that is functioning, because in the United States and Europe, we know that the exact opposite is the case right now. That I was just reading in the New York Times in the last few days that you have people in the United States from my generation and younger leaving the country because of student debt in order to avoid paying it, because they know they're going to go into default. They're literally making themselves refugees just to get away from student debt. All of this that's just one aspect of a completely and utterly disastrous reality for so many people. So when people see that Chinese people are making more money than they ever have, they have more savings than they ever had, they are able to experience high-speed rail, experience electric vehicles, renewable energy on a mass scale, when they see these huge infrastructure development projects, these massive bridges, these hydroelectric, hydrocarbon plants, things like this, they want to know, why don't they have that too? And I think this is what really lies at the root of China-maxxing. So in this moment, I think it's really important to talk about it, because in truth, I think what we're going to see on all fronts for US imperialism and its status as a so-called superpower, the number one so-called country in the world, the biggest economy, we are going to see on all fronts this become more and more clearly not the case. We know that the US dollar is losing massive ground, especially in the last 5 to 10 years. We know that the US share of the entire global economy is just a fraction of what it was after World War II. And we know China's influence in all of these areas, financial and development wise, has only risen. And so the United States right now finds itself struggling against Iran, a country that is seen, at least in the minds of the collective West, as a country that is, and in the United States, as a country that is far weaker, supposedly, than China, right? Like China is the big power. Russia is considered a big power, has nuclear weapons, that is a massive military. But now the U.S. has to come to grips with being beaten by Iran. And this has led a lot of even Western mainstream media commentators to say that Iran's now a fourth global power. So then what does that make China? And what does that mean for people who are observing what China is doing? Because China is not bombing schools full of young children, young girls. China is not targeting civilian infrastructure anywhere in the world. Actually, China is doing the opposite. China is building railroads and train systems for Pakistan, for Ethiopia. China is not seeking to take control over any territorial water right. Actually, because of China's the way China does business around the world, now people get to see that China has not had any impeded access to the Strait of Hormuz throughout this whole ordeal. Why? Because of its friendship and its ability to cooperate with a country like Iran, even under wartime conditions. And so that is only going to escalate and intensify people's interests in what is going on, because what people in the United States are seeing is 21% increase in a month in gas prices. We're seeing massive increases in all prices across the board. That means worsening debt levels. That means that people are going to only be more and more miserable about their own situation. The Global Times even shared a video of a young woman who's just getting gas, and she's crying in her car because she's like, I don't know how I'm going to afford rent if gas is going to be this high for any period of time. And that is just something you don't see coming out of China, because China is going the opposite direction. So at this time, China's momentum is just breakneck. It can't be arrested. The Trump administration today said, Donald Trump said, China's going to be in big trouble if it gives manpads to Iran. But what has Donald Trump said about China in the last several months? Not much, really, because there's a growing trend that the U.S. political class, the U.S. empire, actually cannot right now confront China. That it's just not possible without it itself going through an even graver crisis than what has transpired with Iran. Iran has taken the empire to the brink of an economic, political, and military disaster, one that is unfolding and likely to get worse unless something dramatic changes, and nothing really changed with these Islamabad talks. So this is the direction of the empire. There's the race to the bottom for U.S. imperialism, and then for China, there's a race, but it's really a race to see how far it can go in meeting its objectives, meeting its development goals, and of course, all that this entails. So, in truth, I think what we're seeing from younger people all across the world, especially in the West, who are more and more interested in China, it's really a vocalized expression of uh, this contradiction that's turning quickly into an explosive antagonism. The U.S. empire unable to offer anything to ordinary people, even people who are making six figures in the United States, it can barely offer anything to them. And the opposite is true now in China, where more and more Chinese people who had moved in the past, they're now moving back to China for opportunities in engineering, technology, high tech, in advanced robotics, etc. We're seeing, I think, a massive global shift, which Chinamaxxing comes under the context of. And so it's an exciting time, but I think what Iran teaches us is that the U.S. empire is going to continue to take further and even probably graver risks, knowing that it is currently in a competition that China never even really signed up for, but it's in a competition it cannot win. It cannot win the competition of being a dependable, inspirational and generational power in the world anymore. Those days are over, and I think we're going to see something even more intense than Chinamaxxing very soon. I think we're going to probably see more so the intensification of the collapse of this narrative, this anti-China narrative, because it really can't sustain itself the more that U.S. imperialism has to go further and further to hold on to its hegemony. So that's all I wanted to say. I hope that my connection was good. I really appreciate being invited to this, and yeah, it was a tall order following up George and Jingjing and Tings, but I really appreciate all of you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Danny. Yeah, your audio and video was great. Your content was great. And I appreciate that it was difficult to join after what was most likely a pretty unpleasant flight from New York City. So yeah, thanks so much again. And this is really important. The point you made and the connection with Iran is critically important. Apart from anything else, what a lot of people don't talk about is that this criminal war in Iran is, to a significant degree, also a war on China, right? It's an attempt to control China's energy supply lines, to disrupt the Belt and Road Initiative, to undermine China's influence in the global south, to disrupt the whole multipolar project. And as we face a US-led imperialist world that's in chronic and increasingly severe crisis, that's lashing out in every way, that's dropping any pretense of adherence to international law and to the UN Charter, that's resorting to open criminality and military adventurism, this sort of cooperation between global South, anti-imperialist, and just non-imperialist countries is going to become increasingly essential, possibly even existential, right? The next speaker is going to be Ben Norton. Ben is a journalist and the founder of Geopolitical Economy Report, which provides in-depth analysis of global political economy, imperialism, and multipolarity. Currently based in Beijing, he reports extensively on US foreign policy, the financial system, and the rise of multipolarity. His work has been extremely helpful for those trying to understand the complexities of the current geopolitical situation. So please go ahead, Ben. I will ask you to unmute.
Great. Can you hear me?
Yep, loud and clear.
All right, I'm going to share. I have a presentation. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. And let's see here. Looks like there's a... Okay, can you see the screen?
Got it.
Okay, you can see it? Okay. Thank you for inviting me. This is a very interesting event with so many great participants. Now, I was thinking about the framing of this webinar and the idea of Chinamaxxing, and I decided I would speak about why the world is Chinamaxxing, why China has become increasingly popular. I'll start with the world, and then I'll go to the United States in particular, where Chinamaxxing originated. Now, Gallup published a poll recently that found that China has overtaken the US in global approval ratings, and Pew Research has also found the same thing in its polls. Now, what's important is that both of these surveys were conducted by US firms. So this is incontestable. It's undeniable that around the world, China has become increasingly popular. If you look at Africa in particular, China is extremely popular and has positive approval ratings across the African continent and many parts of Latin America, in several parts of Asia, and even increasingly in Europe. So we have to ask, why is this happening? Well, I think this is probably the easiest question to answer. I mean, we can particularly see it in Washington right now with the extremely low quality of political leadership. Although it's not just Donald Trump, it's easy to blame Trump. But even under Joe Biden, and especially with the genocide in Gaza, we saw US global approval rating fell drastically. And while the US is waging a war of aggression against Iran, Trump is threatening to destroy the Iranian civilization itself Secretary of War Pete Hegseth is boasting about bringing death and destruction upon the people of Iran. Meanwhile, what has China been doing? As is always the case, China is playing a diplomatic role, a role of conciliation, trying to bring about an end to this conflict. And in fact, we know now that China was also trying to broker the failed peace talks between the US and Iran that were held in Pakistan, and they broke down. Moreover, we should keep in mind that just a few years ago, China brokered a historic agreement to facilitate rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia. So while the US is waging war around the world, China is waging peace. And we can see this so clearly with the aggressive unilateralism and imperialism of the US versus China's attempt to foster multilateralism. Trump recently did an interview in which he said, quote, "I don't need international law," end quote. And he said the only limit on his power is his own morality, to the extent that he even has any. Moreover, the US has now withdrawn from most UN bodies except the UN Security Council, of course, in which the US has veto power, which it abuses, and the UN General Assembly. The US recently withdrew from more than 65 international organizations, including most UN bodies. Contrast this with China's multilateralism and the multiple international initiatives launched by China, especially the Global Governance Initiative, that seeks to create a more equitable international order in which the countries of the Global South have equal participation. Now, one of the best ways to understand this is to compare the speeches given in February at the Munich Security Conference by US Secretary of State Marco Rubio and China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi. In his extreme speech, Rubio openly praised Western colonialism. It was essentially, it was an homage to Western colonialism. He talked about how the West was expanding, building vast empires, settling continents, and he lamented that World War II and the defeat of fascism led to the contraction of the European empires. He lamented the anti-colonial uprisings and godless communist revolutions that, according to the US empire, did not liberate the Global South. They actually enslaved the Global South, according to Rubio, because he sees colonialism as the ideal form of political organization, and he vowed to revive Western colonialism. That was the key message of his speech. Compare that to Wang Yi's speech, where he said, "We live in a multipolar world and need to practice true multilateralism." He called for, quote, "greater democracy in international relations," end quote. He called for all countries to abide by the same set of rules, to be equal, including small and medium-sized countries. Again, it's just night and day when you compare these speeches, which is why it's not a surprise that China has become increasingly popular internationally, while the US's approval rating is plummeting. The US has militarily intervened in the vast majority of countries on Earth. China has not fought a war since 1979. Okay, I think I've made that point quite clear. Now, when you invited me to speak, I was thinking more about this concept of Chinamaxxing, right? Where does it come from? It largely comes from TikTok, and it comes from US culture among so-called Gen Z, very young Americans. And among young Americans, especially those born after 2000, I think it's quite clear why China is so popular. Now, one of the first examples we could see of this is when the US government under Biden, Trump tried it in his first term, but under Biden, the US tried to ban TikTok because the US would not tolerate a social media platform that was not owned by a Silicon Valley monopoly. And when Biden tried to do this, over 500,000 so-called TikTok refugees, primarily young Americans, moved over to Xiaohongshu, known in English as RedNote, which is a popular Chinese app, popularly known as the kind of Chinese version of Instagram. And this was shocking for a lot of young Americans because they saw the quality of life in China. and how affordable, especially groceries, are. That was a big issue that so many videos were produced discussing how in the US, food has become so expensive with skyrocketing inflation in recent years and price gouging by corporate monopolies. Whereas in China, food is so affordable that many young Americans were shocked. They were shocked at the high quality and affordable electric vehicles, which you basically cannot get in the US. So why is China so popular among young Americans in particular, the ones who created this concept of Chinamaxxing? For me, it's a no-brainer. Young Americans are utterly disenchanted with the US system and are looking for some kind of alternative. If you look at the approval rating of both Biden and Trump, they're very similar. Biden ended his administration with an approval rating around 40%. It often was in the high 30s. Trump's approval rating is 36%. So we're talking about extremely unpopular political leadership. Congress is even less popular, single-digit approval ratings. When you look at the opinions of both Democrats and Republicans, they are quite low. And when you look at a study that was done by Harvard and young Americans being asked in particular about issue by issue how they see Biden and Trump, you see that neither is often one of the most popular responses, especially when it comes to the genocide in Gaza. We see that 44% of young Americans would rather have neither Biden nor Trump. There's widespread disenchantment. At the same time, study after study has shown that young Americans support socialism. This was a poll that was done by the Heartland Institute, which, as I noted, is a right-wing so-called libertarian think tank funded by big corporations, including cigarette companies and fossil fuel corporations. So, they have a vested interest in overstating the supposed threat posed by socialism. But regardless, it's a very interesting poll that was published in September 2025 that found that a slight majority of young Americans want a socialist to win the presidential election. And even more incredible is that 3/4 want the government to nationalize major industries, including the healthcare industry, energy, and big tech, which, by the way, most of the major companies in these sectors in China are publicly owned. So I think it's quite clear why China has become so popular, in particular among young Americans. It's not just because they like Chinese culture and they like, Chinese music and TV shows and such. It's because China demonstrates that there is a political alternative, that the US political system, which is so unpopular and so completely, at this point, it's totally unjustified. It has lost all popular legitimacy. China has demonstrated that there are other possible forms of social organization that are more equitable, that result in a better quality of living for average people. China has been responsible for 3/4 of global extreme poverty reduction since 1981. Meanwhile, in the US, poverty increases every year. China has eliminated extreme poverty. Poverty is rising in what claims to be the richest country on earth, supposedly. China has lifted 800 million people out of poverty. Meanwhile, every year we see another report about how homelessness has broken the new record in the US. And this is the official data. The reality is that homelessness is significantly worse than the official data says. And what is this alternative that China is offering? China calls it a socialist market economy. It is absolutely socialism. It's not the same totally planned economy that the Soviet Union had. It is a system in which the state owns the most important parts of the economy, the commanding heights of the economy. The state engages in planning in strategic sectors, but also allows market forces and private companies to operate in less strategic sectors in order to drive innovation. And Deng Xiaoping is perhaps one of the most misunderstood political leaders in modern history. There's this simplistic, facile idea in the West that Deng supposedly brought about capitalist restoration in China. And yet, none of these people who claim that China is supposedly capitalist has actually looked at the data. When you look at public property, when you look at state ownership in China, you can see that state-owned enterprises, SOEs, still constitute the driving force of the Chinese economy, the most important part of the Chinese economy, representing around 55% of the assets held by all Chinese companies. If you look at state-owned enterprises in China and you look at their assets as a percentage of GDP compared to Italy, South Korea, India, Saudi Arabia, Norway, which, you know, some young Americans who are interested in socialism, they're often fascinated by Scandinavian social democracy, which they call democratic socialism. Well, even in Norway, which has a very large sovereign wealth fund, a very large state-owned oil sector, still the assets of state-owned enterprises in Norway are about 20% of GDP. In China, it's 200% of GDP. This is socialism. I mean, scientifically, if there's any definition of socialism, this is the definition of socialism. And you look at where the SOEs are concentrated in the Chinese economy. It's in the commanding heights. Some strategic manufacturing and metalworking. The financial system is state-owned, which is extremely important. Telecommunications, energy, transportation. I mean, I know I'm going over my time. The point is that Margaret Thatcher was wrong. Young Americans and young people around the world have been brainwashed for our entire lives. We've been told that there is no alternative, that after the overthrow of the Soviet Union in 1991 and the reform and opening up in China and the supposed restoration of capitalism in China, which is not true, we were told there is no alternative. The only option is neoliberal capitalism and Western so-called democracy, which is not democracy. It is an oligarchy run by capitalist oligarchs. We were told there is no alternative. But China has demonstrated that, yes, there is an alternative. And this is why, for so many people around the world, China has become more and more popular. This is why, in particular, for young Americans who are disenchanted with the capitalist oligarchy in the US and the devastating impact of neoliberal capitalism, I think this goes a long way to explaining why there's so much interest in China and in this idea of Chinamaxxing. China has demonstrated that you can create a better model for the world.
Thank you so much, Ben, for that characteristically rigorous and comprehensive analysis, which was hugely informative, hugely interesting. And yeah, when we contrast these speeches at the Munich Security Conference, you know, the colonialist and frankly fascistic remarks that were made by Marco Rubio with the principled people-centered vision put forward by Wang Yi, you could say that we're very literally seeing Rosa Luxemburg's options of socialism or barbarism play out in real time, right? You know, and in a context of imperial decline, in a context of the collapse of neoliberalism and the Washington Consensus, in a context where capitalism has really run out of road. It's no longer capable of contributing to human progress. Quite the opposite, actually. It's actively destroying the conditions necessary for human survival. Then Chinamaxxing, or taking inspiration from China's vision of peace and progress and cooperation, and therefore building solidarity with China, isn't a fun meme. It's actually a political necessity. So our next speaker is going to be Chen Weihua. Chen is the former EU bureau chief of China Daily. He is still a columnist for China Daily, albeit now mainly happily retired in Shanghai. Lucky him. I've been to both Brussels, where he was based, and Shanghai in the last few months, and I have to say I much prefer the latter. He's one of the most recognizable Chinese journalists in the world, certainly in the Western world. He's known for his incisive and outspoken commentary on US-China relations and Western hypocrisy, particularly on social media, where he's built a large international following. So, Weihua, I will ask you to unmute, and please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much, Carlos, for the introduction. And first of all, I want to thank the Friends of Socialist China for organizing today's events. A friend in need is a friend indeed. I mean, your support for China is very, very important at a time of this hysterical xenophobia and a smear campaign against China by some Western governments, politicians, and the news media. I don't want to repeat what the previous speakers have already said wonderfully, and I just want to make 2 points. One is my just a personal observation of China's phenomenal achievements, and the second is how these achievements are related, should be attributed to China's socialist system. First, my personal observation. Being away, from China for almost 16 years as a foreign correspondent, first in the US and then in Europe. So when I returned, in late 2023, after 4 years of COVID, I was in Europe. And I was surprised, delighted to find more than half of the Shanghai car license plates were green, meaning they are electric cars. All the buses in Shanghai were electric. For those who remember the smell of repugnant car exhaust in the old days, this was so exciting. I've spent much of the past 7 months, Carlos said I was retired officially from China Data, but still not retiring from my professional work. I'm still doing some. So I've been traveling in China a lot. And my 10-year plan, not 5-year plan, is to visit every Chinese province and autonomous regions. So I've already done extensive driving tours in Yunnan, Hainan, and part of Guangdong. So based on what I've seen, I want to tell you that China's efforts to clean up the environment has paid off. The green mountains and the clear waters are mountains of gold, and silver has proven to be a brilliant and a successful national strategy. I have driven extensively in the US and in Europe. I can tell you China's transport infrastructure today is as good or even better than those places. I'm not talking about the 50,000 kilometer high-speed rail, which China needs of the world, obviously. I'm talking about the world-class highways, tunnels, bridges. For example, in the mountainous Yunnan province, Yunnan is the size of Germany. Actually, today's news is that the 56th tunnel, all the 56 tunnel of this Chongqing, Wanzhou high-speed rail has been completed. 56 tunnels. It's going to be part of the artery, linking Beijing and Kunming in Yunnan province. So that's one of the key arteries. So that's how amazing. China has been described as an infrastructure juggernaut or giant. During the recent Spring Festival, the 40-day span, from February to March, people made 9.4 billion cross-regional trips. That's more than the whole world's population. China's transport system is totally capable of handling such a huge capacity. No collapse reported. Amazing. I want to mention other finding others already, the other finding others already mentioned, the technology advancement. While traveling, Jingjing, I'll say, describing Yunnan, poor, underdeveloped region, obviously. But I saw this state-of-art technology, the drones being used in agriculture, spraying. We are scared of hearing the words drones today, right? Because of the wars in Ukraine and in Iran. But it doesn't have to be like this. When I was in Shenzhen, I also saw drone being used in delivering food. It's much quicker, than people on moped. For those of you who live in China, the convenience of food delivery is unrivaled anywhere in the world. E-commerce is very advanced today. I use the credit cards and the cash for shopping in Europe. But in China, cell phone with the Alipay and the WeChat will do everything for you. There are a lot to talk about, such as the Beidou navigation satellite system, the Tiangong space station, the 5G coverage across the whole country, poverty alleviation, as just mentioned, clean tech and renewable technology from solar, wind to EVs. For those who argue that the overcapacity of Chinese EV, they might change their minds today with the fossil fuel supply crisis in the Middle East. China's economic and social achievements are phenomenal. It has become the world's largest manufacturing powerhouse and a technology and innovation leader. Foreign Affairs magazine latest article, which says the title is America is losing the innovation race. Why the future of science might be Chinese. It shows that it is a widely recognized fact and trend. My second point is China's pragmatic socialist system plays a major role in its achievement. I'm not an academic, but it's my observation of the journalists and the Chinese who witnessed China's development in the past 6 decades. You only need to read the latest 15th five-year plan to understand that these achievements are closely related to a socialist system. In fact, the 5-year plan itself is characteristic of a socialist system. If you read the first part of the 15th five-year plan, published a month ago, you will come across the term socialism, socialist modernization, socialist economy, socialist country dozens of times. The document states on page 1 that the 15th five-year plan is a grand blueprint to comprehensively build a modern socialist country. So that's on page 1. I encourage you to read the 5-year plan. For those of you who have not done so, it's a great way to understand China, how it operates, and its trajectory. Yes, to some people, it might feel boring or there is some political slogans, but it has lots of useful details to show what will be the priorities and the guidelines for national development in the coming years. If you read it, you will find it is a document of a socialist system. For the past decades, China has been using the term socialism with Chinese characteristics, as others mentioned. It might be confusing to some. My understanding is that China's huge success lies with its great pragmatism since the late 1970s, the reform and opening up, in developing its socialism or socialist market economy. Never before has socialism been experimented in a large and a populous and a poor country like China. I mean, it has been much more dogmatic, I would say, from the 1950s to the late 70s, but it's been much more pragmatic from the 70s to today. I always tell people that the first thing to understand China is to know what it means to have a 1.4 billion population, a fifth of humanity. It's like you are raising one child, but I'm raising 10 or 50 children. The challenges are very different, and you have to find a way that works for you. You have to adapt to China's national situation. That's kind of a pragmatism and open-mindedness, not dogmatism and narrow-minded thinking, has contributed to China's success, and it's China's contribution to the world in building a socialist system that works. China's socialist modernization is an evolving process. There is still much to be experimented, improved, and corrected. That's why the 15th five-year plan states by 2035, China will to basically realize the socialist modernization. Just remember, to basically realize that's socialist modernization. It means there is still a long march ahead. China's socialist modernization is evolution process. I mean, Chinese today don't like the word revolution. However, if you look at China in a span of 10, 20 years, it often looks like a revolution in terms of the great social and economic transformation. Lastly, during my travel across China in the past 7 months, I find in many of the regions which are regarded as less developed, underdeveloped, such as Yunnan, Hainan, the infrastructure facility services, 5G roads, are as good as anywhere in China or in the world. A socialist system means that you will provide this service to the people, even they don't make any money or make any business sense at all. A socialist government does not have to maximize the profits for corporate shareholders. I spent many years covering Washington politics. I would say that the lobby industry, whether from the military industry complex, the pharmaceutical industry, or just the National Rifle Association, has heavily influenced US government and the lawmakers' decision-making. It's not the case in China due to its socialist system. In fact, the Washington lobby industry would be declared illegal and cracked down as corruption in China. I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Weihua, for those extremely insightful remarks, and also for your kind words about Friends of Socialist China. I have to say, this work of telling the truth about China, or of raising people's understanding about China, building solidarity with China, is today much easier than it was when we started 5 years ago. Back then, this anti-China hysteria was dominant, even in leftist circles, I would say. Even the Western left felt that China was maybe a new imperialist power and so on. But today, for the reasons yourself and the other panelists have been talking about, people are much more open to learning about China than before. And meanwhile, the West is in decline, right? So this China-maxing phenomenon is, at least to some degree, a reflection of people's desperation with declining conditions in the West, with rising poverty, with endless war, with genocide, and with environmental destruction. So yes, thank you very much again. Our next speaker is going to be Creighton from Qiao Collective. Qiao Collective is a diaspora Chinese media and research collective dedicated to building solidarity between Chinese people and other oppressed peoples, and to challenging anti-China narratives from a left and anti-imperialist perspective. Founded in 2020, the collective has produced some of the most rigorous and widely shared analyses of the Xinjiang propaganda campaign, the Hong Kong situation, and the new Cold War, always grounding their work in a commitment to internationalism and anti-imperialism. So Creighton, please go ahead. I will ask you to unmute.
Thank you. I apologize in advance if we experience any technical difficulties. It's been a little bit difficult here, but I'm so thankful to the organizers of this event and the rest of the panel speakers. Thank you for your wonderful contributions and all of your hard work and solidarity with China. I'm really happy to share that I'm currently China-maxxing and calling in from Beijing. I arrived this morning and was greeted by the most beautiful, perfect spring day with fluffy catkins floating on the breeze and flowering trees lining the highways. And this was such a welcome change of scenery from the kind of capitalist hellscape that I'm used to as a resident of the US. I felt an enormous gratitude to be in China and for China's existence at a time when socialist and sovereign state projects are facing existential threats from the US and its imperialist aggression on multiple fronts. Whenever I come to China, I feel so much better and freer and replenished and actually hopeful about the state of the world. And the reason for this is that there's a Communist Party of China, which everyone here has spoken about so eloquently, and its devotion to improving the quality of life for all Chinese people. And as our previous panelists have pointed out, China's made monumental progress in poverty alleviation, infrastructural projects, agricultural sovereignty, overall making vast improvements in ordinary people's quality of life. A few decades ago, you might have said that China appeared to be on an opposite trajectory of counter-revolutionary retreat, but today, Chinese people enjoy luxuries that Westerners like myself can only dream of. Good governance, which is the scarcest resource in the world right now, a high trust society, beautiful cities, and a system capable of enacting rapid positive change. So as Carlos previously pointed out, it's unsurprising that given the unprecedented access that Westerners have into the everyday lives of Chinese people, thanks to platforms like TikTok and Xiaohongshu, a lot of people are seeing the obvious appeal of whatever it is that Chinese people seem to have going on. Without realizing that its formula for success is a communist political party. So I think we've all underscored the point that to seize on the opportunity that China-maxxing and this trend has given to us is to connect the appeal of China to Marxism, Leninism and socialist organization. I think when people think of Chinamaxxing, they probably think about I Show Speed, Adidas China exclusives, and charming cigarette packaging. I've seen plenty of commentators observe that this trend is mostly comprised of shifts in consumption habits, aesthetic tastes, and superficial adoption of Chinese cultural practices, which are admittedly not great vehicles for consciousness raising, and may even serve to depoliticize the fact of China's achievements through socialism by attributing its success to a kind of abstracted, essentialized Chineseness, which is often viewed through a lens of Orientalism. I think memes can sometimes be a useful shorthand for big ideas, and humor can make space for political positions that are sidelined, demonized, or outright censored here in the core, but it's obviously not a substitute for deep study or real engagement with people who are actively applying Marxism, Leninism to their objective conditions, which is happening. Millions of people are undertaking that process here in China. Engaging with an idea that is as dangerous to capitalism as socialism lowers the stakes of being pro-China. Engaging with it through humor, with this idea of socialism, lowers the stakes of being pro-China in what is still a rapidly xenophobic and anti-communist society. So I do see the optimism and the opportunity that is inherent in the Chinamaxxing meme. I think capitalizing on it is going to be a challenge. Which leads me to my next point. And this is something that we've talked about within Chak Collective. Two of our members, I should point out, have already shared our analysis in a previous episode of the China Report, in which one of my comrades made an excellent statement about the depoliticized nature of the meme. He said that Chinamaxxing, quote, can slide into a form of ahistorical escapism when the positive aspects of modern China are taken out of context and separated from the longer history of semi-colonial subjugation and violent revolutionary struggle that made its current prosperity possible. Without that memory culture, Chinamaxxing in the West risks squandering its potential for deeper anti-imperialist politicization in favor of quiescence and pure escapism without a robust memory culture, end quote. So at this level of vibes, I think a lot of liberals are obviously disillusioned, disenchanted with a very bleak outlook that they've been confronted with. And they don't feel very good about who they are and what their role in the global economic order has been revealed to be through the genocide in Palestine, or what their government does. And they're reaching for an alternative identity in a kind of directionless manner. And they're feeling the gravitational pull of China the same way everyone else in the world is currently. So I don't know if this is really indicative of a measurable internal shift or acceptance of socialism. It might be, I hope it is, but liberals don't spontaneously become Marxist-Leninists. And just because they realize America sucks, they don't spontaneously develop a coherent and humane framework when their old one is exposed as barbaric, but those are changes that need to occur in order for that consciousness raising to happen. So I think this point about nurturing the historical memory of struggle is very important. Back when we first opened up discussion about this meme, my instinct was to point back to the COVID-19 pandemic and public health emergency as an event that gave rise to the meme. It was a crisis that I think coincided with the death of, I guess, what we could call woke neoliberalism, identity politics of that decade in the 2010s, which paved the way for neo-fascism. And so I think it's apt to think through that moment again, now that we're facing an imminent energy crisis that will make Americans' pockets hurt and trigger collapse that needs to be met with an organized response. I think the pandemic was the last crisis that is really comparable to the looming energy crisis that we're about to face. And the task remains the same, but it will be occurring under much more difficult conditions because of the organizational paralysis, ideological disintegration, and timidity of the Western left since 2020. So Chinamaxxing is a deeply ambivalent meme for a deeply ambivalent population. And I think we need more than escapism and nihilism and compensatory humor to deal with the absence of socialism as an organizing force here. And what would excite me more than a shallow engagement with Chinese culture and this ambivalent embrace of Chinese dominance is a recommitment to anti-fascism, which can be achieved through the study of Chinese history, and is a suppressed aspect of China's success, and the recognition that as imperial core workers, our disidentification with empire and American national mythologies should lead us not necessarily to a vague becoming Chinese or entering a Chinese time of our lives, but taking up the task of debilitating empire from within and forging links through internationalism with other communist movements and sovereign movements throughout the world. And so in an environment of AI-driven mass surveillance and manipulation, a lack of credible institutions, widespread hostility and distrust, I think it is natural that people do see China as an optimistic, or as a source of optimism and hope for the future, and that people will naturally connect with what is sincere and beautiful and validated by real experience, and the concrete reality that we see in China in the success of socialism. And so I would encourage people to take that seriously if they feel ambivalent about China. I think the antidote to the nihilism that we face in the core is mass communist politics articulated as an organized party that brings together a lot of our disparate efforts. And there's no shortcut to building the party. But China's socialist revolution and political economic model is an enormous resource to us as an economic, spiritual, ideological, developmental, and diplomatic resource to the third world as well. And I'd argue to the internal colonies in particular within the US. But China can't do our work for us. It can't be a substitute for the work that we have to do to create fractures within the ruling party, for the ruling class, or a debilitating empire from within. We can all agree here that it's a foregone conclusion that we are in the Chinese century. And even though there remains a lot of denial about the US's ability to project power and militarily enforce the value drainage mechanisms of imperialism, we can all agree that we are living in a different world because of China. And that world is a better one because China is socialist. So there's no easy way out from the situation that we find ourselves in, kind of like an American samsara. And we keep refusing to accept that communism is how we exit that cycle of suffering. And if Chinamaxxing is a means of smuggling in some socialist propaganda and education, so be it. But I think we deserve sharper tools, which is why I'm very grateful this panel is doing precisely that. And anything that gives us hope for the advancement of socialism at a time of profound nihilism, despair, and organizational paralysis should be preserved and celebrated. Thank you so much for inviting me to this talk, Carlos.
Amazing. A million thanks, Creighton. A, for joining again in very difficult circumstances, and B, for those really thoughtful and thought-provoking remarks. And it is important to be able to point out some of these more problematic aspects of Chinamaxxing, and to be able to critique its limitations. Like, after all, for decades, right, many young people in the West have been more or less obsessed with Japanese culture, art, habits, and so on, and that's got nothing to do with socialism, because Japan has never been a socialist or anything like it, and Chinamaxxing has got some similarities to that Japan obsession. And as Creighton said, much of this narrative that's around at the moment sort of strips China of its politics, strips it of its history, and it removes the issue of social class from the discussion altogether. But I would say that nevertheless, it's the case that this phenomenon couldn't have happened a few years ago, and that the sort of anti-China hysteria that was pervasive a few years ago simply isn't viable anymore. And even liberal young people who are engaging with China in a pretty superficial way, they can still be impressed with China's undeniable achievements, especially in poverty alleviation, especially in green energy, and China becoming far and away the world's only renewable energy superpower, etc., etc. So I think it does give us a lever to try to educate people in a more serious way. Right, next and penultimate speaker is Ileana Chen. Ileana is an actress, activist, and podcast host of Chinese heritage, born to a Malaysian father and a mother born in the Philippines. She worked as strategic communications and digital campaign manager for Stella Assange. She's a committee member of Friends of Socialist China, and she hosts the Global Majority for Peace podcast on the Empire Watch YouTube channel, amplifying anti-imperialist voices from the global south and challenging Western propaganda and neo-colonial narratives. Go ahead, Ileana. I think you've probably got the power to unmute yourself.
Yes, I have. Thank you so much, Carlos. I think it's very fitting that I am speaking right after Creighton because I think I'm actually going to be addressing this question, but from a Southeast Asian perspective, because I too have been thinking about this question. Why should we in Southeast Asia care about a frivolous Western social media trend like Chinamaxxing? Because let's be honest, as Tings mentioned, it hasn't really gained traction in the global South in the same way. The tropes of Chinamaxxing, drinking hot water, eating rice porridge, wearing indoor slippers aren't particularly novel in Southeast Asia. We have a long history of Chinese migration, deep cultural overlap, and large Chinese diasporas. So yes, the memes are fun, funny even, and they're welcome in a general kind of counter to anti-China sentiment. But if we're talking about Chinamaxxing just as a Western viral phenomenon, it falls short. It doesn't land the same way it does in the West. So the question that I would have at first, instinctively, would be, by amplifying its importance, are we still seeking Western validation? Are we just welcoming cultural appropriation? What is the point of this? And certainly, if we are just thinking of it as a Western apolitical social media meme that Creighton elucidated very clearly before this, the answer to those questions would be yes. However, this is not about just social media, and I think this webinar really illuminates that. The phenomenon of Chinamaxxing is that it signals a new stage for humanity, and that is why it holds a much deeper significance. For decades in Southeast Asia, we have lived with the Cold War era dichotomy. On one side is US imperialism, with their propaganda machine built on disinformation, smears, and the erasure of the atrocities committed in this region during its anti-China, anti-communist campaigns. When I interviewed the Indonesian journalist for Febriana Firdaus, who faced consequences as recently as 2016 for reporting on Indonesia's 1965 US-backed genocide, where anywhere from 500,000 to 1 million people were reported to have disappeared due to suspected socialist affiliations. She recounted her own personal experience of finding out years after the fact that her grandfather had been taken by government officials on this pretext. No one ever heard from him again, and no one ever talked about why he disappeared. My father in Malaysia also recounted a similar experience of a classmate disappearing for having anti-colonial socialist leanings, and a teacher's reprimand for silence when questioned. It is a measure of how effective US anti-China, anti-communist propaganda was that all 30 of his classmates believed that this boy that was taken and detained deserved it because he was a communist. Ultimately, these tactics worked. In the words of my father, nobody would even dare to whisper the word socialism. And the generation after my father's, my generation, knows nothing about our country's socialist histories. US imperialism disappeared a whole generation of socialist thought leaders and revolutionaries, and consequently, in the war of ideas, completely obliterated socialism in the region outside of the two countries, Vietnam and Laos, that achieved their people's revolution. There is a trauma embedded in this erasure, and it has lasting psychological consequences. Instead of understanding underdevelopment as the direct outcome of imperialism in the forms of extraction, military aggression, and coercive economic structures, people were encouraged to internalize it as individual or cultural failure. And that extended to our view of China. China was poor because they were inferior. We internalized an inferiority complex and a set of very potent self-limiting beliefs that corruption is innate in our populations, that incompetence is cultural, that the West is morally superior, that Western intervention is benevolent, and most importantly, that resistance is futile because there is no alternative. These beliefs were cultivated in the vacuum of historical memory and political education. China's socialist achievements directly challenge this. They show in concrete, measurable terms that an alternative exists. And this is the other side of the Cold War that US imperialist narratives worked so hard to bury. A socialist system rooted in people's power and collective prosperity, and operating with a completely different strategy for winning the war of ideas. China's approach is encapsulated by Deng Xiaoping's well-known quote, "Socialism is not poverty. Development is the hard truth." In other words, while the US requires us to deny reality and accept fabrication in order to uphold its imperial system, China, by contrast, argues that the most persuasive case for socialism is not messaging tactics at all, but material improvement, the ability to deliver concrete gains in people's lives. And as China has delivered these concrete gains, we can see that it is a strategy that is currently bearing fruit. In the West, we have Chinamaxxing, born out of people seeing video evidence on Rednote or on social media and celebrating that in their own way through a fun meme. In Southeast Asia, because of proximity, people are more likely to actually travel to China themselves to witness this in person. I witnessed this myself, going to China for the first time when I was 9, and then in the 2000s, and again last year. And it did aid and galvanize my own political education, which is still ongoing. It drives my curiosity, and it is a huge part of the reason for my belief that we can do better in the West and that we have to do better. And as my father tells me too, the very classmates who held on to their anti-China, anti-communist beliefs for decades have now themselves traveled to China and are reversing their opinions. Their first-hand experiences have led them to question the narrative that they accepted without question decades ago and to seek answers for what happened to their classmate. Unfortunately, he was detained, obviously, without trial. No one really knows how long he was detained for, and he was quietly released. But this is just a testament that if we can witness with our own eyes China's achievements, we can witness with our own eyes China's achievements, the 850 million people lifted out of poverty, life expectancy gains, clear measurements of life improvements, massive infrastructure systems, the deep indoctrination of Western imperialism can be broken through. The evidence is all across Southeast Asia in the regional frameworks that provide a clear alternative to Western coercive institutions. China's prosperity for all extends outward. The countries in Southeast Asia who seize on the opportunities that China is offering are reaping the rewards. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, is currently China's biggest bilateral trade partner, and the Belt and Road Initiative has already delivered Southeast Asia's first high-speed railway in Indonesia, the China-Laos Railway, Cambodia's first expressway and a new airport, Malaysia's East Coast Rail Link, and dozens of hydropower plants and special economic zones across the region. In total, China has built or is building over 1,800 kilometers of new rail, thousands of megawatts of energy capacity, and billions of dollars in ports and industrial zones. On the flip side, to illustrate what happens when you embed yourself more further into US imperial systems, we have the example of the Philippines, which after decades of US-aligned neoliberal policy has been the first country to declare a national energy emergency due to the US-Israeli war on Iran. So in conclusion, China is significant because it marks a new stage in humanity. It is useful, it is still useful because it invites curiosity in a pretty low stakes way, safely, playfully, openly, And we don't have to manufacture anything to meet that curiosity. The reality of what people can see, measure, and experience is more persuasive than any propaganda we are fed. And I personally am hoping that this opening will allow the next generation in Southeast Asia to heal the wounds of imperialism and to rebuild the political socialist movements we need, because as Chinamaxxing definitively illustrates, US imperialism has failed and the path forward for human progress is socialist. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much, Ileana. And really interesting and important to get a Southeast Asian perspective on this question. And to see China in recent decades developing these extremely close economic and diplomatic ties with its Southeast Asian neighbors, for example, with the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the RCEP, being the world's largest free trade agreement, and with China becoming the most important partner for these countries to upgrade their infrastructure, such as with high-speed rail links in Laos, Indonesia, and elsewhere, and with China helping to mediate conflicts in the region and consistently promoting peace, we're seeing a massive defeat for the colonial divide and rule politics that the US have been pursuing for decades, and which Britain, Japan, and the Netherlands pursued before that. So really interesting, really important developments. Thank you very much. So our final speaker today is Keith Bennett. Keith is a veteran Marxist and one of Britain's foremost specialists on China and Chinese socialism. He spent decades building Britain-China solidarity, having first visited Beijing in 1981. Actually, he tells me that today marks exactly 45 years to the day since he first set foot in China. Keith is co-editor of Friends of Socialist China and co-editor with me of the volume People's China at 75, The Flag Stays Red. Go ahead, Keith. I will ask you to unmute.
Right. Thank you very much, Carlos. Thank you very much, Carlos, and everybody for sticking with this long webinar. We've had some amazing and excellent speakers on the present trend of Chinamaxxing, and they've been so amazing and eloquent that, let's just say, I'm going to use the shorter version of my own speech. For my part, I'm going to briefly attempt to give a certain historical and comparative perspective to the phenomenon of Chinamaxxing that we see today, a perspective going back to the 1960s and 1970s, and therefore, if you like, making a case that what we see today is at least Chinamaxxing 2.0, even if the term itself didn't previously exist. My focus here is going to be on the cultural rather than the party political, although the background and context are inevitably political. The late 1960s and the 1970s were a time of great change in China. Political life was still in tumult, but the mass mobilizations of the Cultural Revolution abated and were curtailed. A stridently revolutionary foreign policy gave way to handshakes between Chairman Mao and President Nixon. But what remained at the time was the sense that China was a remote and somewhat mysterious place, literally a world away from the West. Few people went there. And besides political considerations on both sides, there were also objective factors. For example, social media and mobile telephony simply did not exist. Yet the fascination for China in important sectors of Western societies belied and overcame the physical and mental remoteness. The political seeped into the cultural, and each impacted on the other. Barely 2 months after France had been shaken by the events of May 1968, and 4 months after demonstrators protesting the American war in Vietnam had clashed with police outside the US Embassy in London, the Beatles recorded a track entitled Revolution, composed by John Lennon. Initially released as the B-side to the single Hey Jude, it includes the lines, "But if you go carrying pictures of Chairman Mao, you ain't gonna make it with anyone anyhow." They may have been meant to express disapproval, but Lenin had certainly noticed the phenomenon. Moreover, the lyrics encountered a backlash. By January 1971, in a conversation with Tariq Ali, Lennon said of the song, "I made a mistake, you know. The mistake was that it was anti-revolution." The following year, he remarked, "I should never have said that about Chairman Mao." The partial opening of China that was perhaps first indicated by ping-pong diplomacy, the surprise invitation to the US table tennis team to proceed from the 1971 World Championships in Nagoya, Japan, to China, a country in which barely a handful of US citizens had set foot in more than 3 decades, also triggered musical responses in Britain. Incidentally, I read that this weekend there have been major celebrations of the 55th anniversary of ping-pong diplomacy with a message from Xi Jinping and the participation of the Vice President, Han Chen. But back to the musical response in Britain at that time. In 1972, Matching Mole, a progressive rock band formed by Robert Wyatt after he left Soft Machine, released their second album, Matching Mole's Little Red Record. Obviously inspired by Chairman Mao's Little Red Book, as it was generally known, the cover was a pastiche of a famous Chinese revolutionary poster of the time that carried the then popular slogan, "We are determined to liberate Taiwan." In 1974, Brian Eno, hitherto of Roxy Music, and today the president of the Stop the War Coalition, released his second solo album. Taking Tiger Mountain by Strategy was named after one of the 7 model revolutionary operas of the Cultural Revolution. But if there was, inter alia, an element of parody in these artistic expressions, Cornelius Cardew was an example of someone who went all the way. Considered Britain's most outstanding experimental musician, Cardew began his career as an assistant to Karl-Heinz Stockhausen. His first expression of interest in Chinese culture was his The Great Learning, a work in 7 parts or paragraphs based on translations of Confucius by Ezra Pound. A few years later, he joined the Marxist-Leninist movement, subsequently becoming a founding and leading member of the Revolutionary Communist Party of Britain Marxist-Leninist, and repudiated his previous work. He formed the band People's Liberation Music, doubtless with a nod to the People's Liberation Army, whose performances from the back of a lorry became ubiquitous at trade union, anti-fascist and anti-racist and anti-imperialist demonstrations. His works of that period included Revolution is the Main Trend, which set to music the words of Chairman Mao's May the 20th, 1970 statement calling on the people of the world to unite to defeat the US aggressors and all their running dogs, and arrangements for violin and piano and violin respectively of the 2 most popular Chinese revolutionary songs of the time, The East is Red and Sailing the Seas Depends on the Helmsman. Norway was a country where a significant number of the leading cultural personalities took the Cardew route of walking the walk in fully immersing themselves in the revolutionary movement, in their case through membership of the Workers' Communist Party Marxist-Leninist. One example is the award-winning novelist Per Pettersson. His 2008 novel, I Curse the River of Time, draws in part from his years in the party, and its title is taken from the first line of Chairman Mao's 1959 poem, Shaoshan Revisited, regarding his return to his birthplace after an absence of 32 years, albeit the official English translation renders it as I curse the long-fled past. The novel recalls the response in Oslo to Mao's death in September 1976, and it was referenced as follows in a November 2013 article by Tariq Ali in The Guardian. Tariq wrote, "It was Norway where Maoism became a genuine popular force and hegemonic in the culture. The daily paper Klassekampen still exists, now as an independent daily with a very fine crop of gifted journalists, mainly women, and a growing circulation. October is a leading fiction publishing house, and May was a successful record company. Per Pettersson, one of the country's most popular novelists, describes in a recent book how, when Mao died, 100,000 people in a population of 5 million marched with torches to a surprised Chinese embassy to offer collective condolences." Clearly, the world of the late 1960s and the first half of the 1970s is a very different one from that of today, and one should be careful of overgeneralization and direct comparison. But whilst the forms taken by what we might call Chinamaxxing 1.0 and Chinamaxxing 2.0 might be very different, the underlying essence presents a more nuanced picture. By the late 1960s, the post-war boom was starting to open up higher education beyond the elite. France had experienced the Algerian War of Independence. The Vietnamese People's War of Liberation divided American society from top to bottom. The civil rights movement became the struggle for Black power and went from pacifism to urban insurrection. Likewise, in Ireland, the brutal suppression of the peaceful civil rights struggle gave rise to a fully fledged armed struggle. A series of audacious hijackings brought the struggle of the Palestinian people to the attention of the world. The struggles against racism and imperialism infused, inspired, and imparted militancy to the movements for women's liberation and gay liberation. Today, we see the ever-increasing and ever more visible inability of social democracy to represent working-class interests in even a partial or degenerated way. We see decaying infrastructure, rising poverty, and an increasingly vicious assault on democratic rights. Something like 500 peaceful demonstrators going up to people in their 80s arrested in Trafalgar Square for peacefully holding placards under terrorism legislation yesterday. We see an utterly discredited, corrupt, and venal ruling class, now aptly called the Epstein class, with its tentacles reaching from the White House to the royal family to the Labour Party. A looming climate catastrophe. The promised peace dividend with the end of Cold War I has become the forever wars and Cold War II, and the nuclear clock ticks ominously closer to midnight. While an earlier generation of young people was moved to tears and roused to action by the pictures of a little Vietnamese girl running screaming down the road, her body aflame with napalm, today's generation is similarly moved and roused by the genocide in Gaza and increasingly elsewhere in the region that is live-streamed 24/7 on their phones. Whether in the 1960s and 1970s or today, young people in particular, in looking for explanations and alternatives, saw and are increasingly starting to see that China presents a different option, that a better world is not only necessary but possible, that it actually exists and is being built. Whether in the 1960s and 70s or today, Chinamaxxing, looking to China as a reference point and inspiration, and for answers to some of the greatest and most existential questions facing humanity, was not wrong then, and it is not wrong now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Keith, for that insight into what Chinamaxxing looked like almost half a century ago. And it's a very valuable reminder to everyone that, you know, this struggle against imperialism and for socialism is not a transient phenomenon like Chinamaxxing may very well turn out to be. It's actually a multi-generational, long-term struggle, you know, and that's very important in a culture that's, you know, pretty much obsessed with things that are new and things that are novel, and where trends come and go. Actually, the project that we're involved in collectively is one that lasts for generations, and we must always be connected to the history of it in order to be connected to the future of it. So that was the last presentation of the webinar. A huge thank you to the speakers for their really fascinating presentations, and thank you so much to the audience for sticking with us. My apologies. I generally pride myself on being a fairly militant chair, but my timekeeping has been appalling today. You can blame the speakers for being too damn interesting, but the result of all of that is that we've been going on for 2 hours and 20 minutes, and we don't have any time for question and answers. What's more, I mean, it's past midnight in China, where the vast majority of the speakers are located. So yeah, my apologies for that, but please do keep in touch. We update the Friends of Socialist China website, which is socialistchina.org, on average at least once a day, with, we like to think, some of the best material on China, Chinese socialism, China's international relations. We also have a mailing list, which you can join via the website. If you look on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/ at Friends of Socialist China. You'll see all the many webinars we've done over the last 5 years. So we very much look forward to seeing you again soon, to working with you, to build solidarity with China, to spread the truth about China, to oppose imperialism, and to support socialism. Thank you all again very much.